Meditations of the Seven Sorrows of Mary, according to the visions of Saint Bridget of Sweden. The first sorrow, the prophecy of Simeon. For though by divine inspiration I knew that my son was to suffer, yet this grief pierced my heart more keenly at Simeon's words, when he said that a sword should pierce my soul, and that my son should be set for a sign to be contradicted. And until I was assumed in body and soul to heaven, this grief never left my heart, although it was tempered by the consolation of the Spirit of God. I also wish you to know that from that day my grief was sixfold. The first was in my knowledge, for every time that I looked upon my son, wrapped him in his swaddling clothes, or gazed upon his hands and feet, so often was my soul swallowed up as it were by fresh grief, for I thought how he was to be crucified. In the second place, there was pain in my hearing, for as often as I heard the opprobriums heaped on my son, the falsehoods uttered against him, the snares laid for him, my soul was so afflicted that I could scarcely contain myself, but by the power of God my grief knew bounds and respect, so that no impatience or levity was seen in me. In the third place I suffered by sight, for when I beheld my son, bound and scourged, and suspended on the cross, I fell, as it were, lifeless. But recovering myself, I stood mourning and suffering so patiently that neither my enemies nor any others beheld anything but gravity in me. My fourth suffering was in the touch, for I with others took my son down from the cross, wrapped him up, and laid him in the tomb, and thus my grief increased, so that my hands and feet had scarce strength to bear me. Oh, how gladly would I have been laid beside my son! Fifthly, I suffered by a vehement desire of joining my son after he ascended to heaven, because the long delay which I had in this world, after his ascension, increased my grief. Sixthly, I suffered from the tribulations of the apostles and friends of God, ever fearing and grieving, fearing that they might yield to temptations and tribulations, grieving because my son's words were everywhere contradicted. But though the grace of God always preserved with me, and my will always conformed to the will of God, yet my grief was constantly mingled with consolation, till I was assumed, body and soul, to my Son in heaven. Let not then this grief leave thy heart, for without tribulation few would reach heaven. The second sorrow, the flight into Egypt. As to why I fled to Egypt, I answer, before the commandment was transgressed, there was just one road to heaven, broad and bright. It was broad in the abundance of virtues, and bright in divine wisdom and in the obedience of a good will. Once that will was changed, two roads came into being. One led to heaven, the other led away from it. Obedience led to heaven, disobedience led astray. And as the choice between good and evil lay in the human will, that is, to obey or not to obey, people sinned whenever they willed something other than what I wanted them to will. In order to save humankind, it was just and right that someone should come who was able to redeem them, someone who was also perfectly obedient and innocent, someone towards whom those who wished could show love, and those who wished could show malice. However, it was not right for an angel to be sent to redeem humankind, because I, God, do not give my glory to others, nor could any human person be found to appease me for his or her own sake, let alone for others. So I, God, the only just one, came to make all just. My flight to Egypt revealed the frailty of my human nature, and fulfilled a prophecy. I also set an example for those to come, because persecution should at times be avoided for God's greater glory in the future. My escape from my pursuers shows that my divine plans surpassed humans' plans, for it is not easy to fight against God. Furthermore, the slaying of the infants was a sign of my future passion and a mystery of vocation and divine charity. Although the infants themselves did not bear witness to me with their voice and mouth, yet they bore it by their death, as befitted my own infancy. Indeed, it had been foreseen that the praise of God will be fulfilled even by the blood of innocents. And although the malice of the unjust fell upon them, yet my divine permission, which is always just and kind, did not expose them to it with injustice, but so as to disclose human malice and the incomprehensible purpose and kindness of God. Thus, where unjust malice erupted against the boys, their merit and grace justly abounded, and where there was no verbal testimony or proper age, their bloodshed brought them the highest good. The third sorrow, the loss of Jesus in the temple. Mary and Joseph repeated their visit to the temple at the feast of the unleavened bread every year. Also, when the divine child was 12 years old, and when it was time to allow the splendors of his inaccessible and divine light to shine forth, they went to the temple for this feast. Having thus spent all the 7 days of the feast, they betook themselves on their way home to Nazareth. When his parents departed from Jerusalem and were pursuing their way homeward, the child Jesus withdrew from them without their knowledge. When afterwards she became aware of her not being accompanied by her sweetest and beloved son, she supposed that the blessed Joseph had taken him along and that the Lord accompanied his foster father for his consolation. Thus assured, Holy Mary and Joseph pursued their home journey for an entire day, as St. Luke tells us. As the pilgrims proceeded onwards, they gradually thinned out, each taking his own direction and joining again with his wife or family. The Most Holy Mary and Saint Joseph found themselves at length in the place where they had agreed to meet on the first evening after leaving Jerusalem. When the great lady saw that the child was not with Saint Joseph, and when the holy patriarch found that he was not with his mother, the two were struck dumb with amazement and surprise for quite a while. Both, governed in their judgment by their most profound humility, felt overwhelmed with self-reproach at their remissness in watching over the Most Holy Son, and thus blamed themselves for his absence. For neither of them had any suspicion of the mysterious manner in which he had been able to elude their vigilance. After a time, they recovered somewhat from their astonishment, and with deepest sorrow took counsel with each other as to what was to be done. The loving mother said to Saint Joseph, "My spouse and my master, my heart cannot rest, unless we return with all haste to Jerusalem, in order to seek my most holy Son." This they proceeded to do, beginning their search among their relations and friends, of whom, however, none could give them any information or any comfort in their sorrow. On the contrary, their answers only increased their anxiety, since none of them had so much as seen their son since the departure from Jerusalem. Thus the sincerest dove persevered in her tears and groans without cessation or rest, without sleeping or eating anything for 3 whole days. Not all the sorrows suffered by all the martyrs ever reached the height of the sorrows of Most Holy Mary in this trial, nor will the patience, resignation, and tolerance of this lady ever be equaled, nor can they, for the loss of Jesus was greater to her than the loss of anything created, while her love and appreciation of him exceeded all that can be conceived by any other creature. Since she did not know the cause of the loss, her anxiety was beyond all measure. Moreover, during these 3 days the Lord left her to her natural resources of nature and of grace, deprived of special privileges and favors, for, with the exception of the company and companionship of the angels, he suspended all the other consolations and blessings so constantly vouchsafed to her most holy soul. From this, we can surmise what sorrow filled the loving heart of the Heavenly Mother. But, O prodigy of holiness, prudence, fortitude, and perfection, in such unheard of affliction and sorrow, she was not disturbed, nor lost her interior or exterior peace, nor did she entertain a thoughts of anger or indignation, nor allowed herself any improper movement or expression, nor fell into any excess of grief or annoyance, as is so common in great affliction with other children of Adam, who allow all their passions and faculties to be disarranged, yes, even in small difficulties. The mistress of all virtue held all her powers in heavenly order and harmony. Though her sorrow was without comparison great and had pierced her inmost heart, she felt not in reverence and in the praise of the Lord, nor ceased in her prayers and petitions for the human race and for the finding of her most holy Son. Then the thought struck her, that, since he was not with the poor, he no doubt tarried in the temple, as in the house of God and of prayer. The holy angels encouraged her and said, "Our Queen and our Lady, the hour of thy consolation is at hand. Soon wilt thou see the light of thy eyes. Hasten thy footsteps, and go to the temple." The glorious patriarch, Saint Joseph, at this moment again met his spouse, for, in order to increase their chance of finding the divine child, they had separated in different directions. By another angel, he had now been likewise ordered to proceed to the temple. During all these 3 days he had suffered unspeakable sorrow and affliction, hastening from one place to another, sometimes without his heavenly spouse, sometimes with her. He was in serious danger of losing his life during this time, if the hand of the Lord had not strengthened him, and if the most prudent lady had not consoled him and forced him to take some food and rest. His sincere and exquisite love for the divine child made him so anxious and solicitous to find him, that he would have allowed himself no time or care to take nourishment for the support of nature. When he, Jesus, had finished, all the teachers of the law arose with stupendous amazement. The heavenly lady, absorbed in joy, approached her most loving son, and in the presence of the whole assembly spoke to him the words recorded by St. Luke: Son, why hast thou done so to us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. This loving complaint the heavenly mother uttered with equal reverence and affection, adoring him as God and manifesting her maternal affliction. The Lord answered, Why is it that you sought me? Did you not know that must be about my Father's business? The evangelist says that they did not understand the mystery of these words, for it was hidden at the time to Most Holy Mary and Saint Joseph, and for two reasons. On the one hand, the interior joy now reaping what they had sown in so much sorrow, and the visible presence of their precious treasure entirely filled the faculties of their souls, and on the other hand, the time for the full comprehension of what had just been treated of in this discussion had not yet arrived for them. Moreover, for the most solicitous queen, there was another hindrance just at that time, and it was that the veil, concealing the interior of her most holy Son, had again intervened and was not removed until some time later. The learned men departed, commenting in their amazement upon the wonderful event by which they had been privileged to hear the teaching of eternal wisdom, though they did not recognize it. Being thus left alone, the Blessed Mother, embracing him with maternal affection, said to him, Permit my longing heart, my son, to give expression to its sorrow and pain, so that it may not die of grief as long as it can be of use to thee. Do not cast me off from thy sight, but accept me as thy slave. If it was my negligence which deprived me of thy presence, pardon me and make me worthy of thy company, and do not punish me with thy absence. The divine child received her with signs of pleasure, and offered himself as her teacher and companion until the proper time should arrive. Thus was the dove-like and affectionate heart of the great lady appeased, and they departed for Nazareth. The fourth sorrow. Mary meets Jesus on the way to Calvary. The second fall of Jesus. The afflicted mother of Jesus had left the forum, accompanied by John and some other women, immediately after the unjust sentence was pronounced. She had employed herself in walking to many of the spots sanctified by our Lord, and watering them with her tears. But when the sound of the trumpet, the rush of the people, and the clang of the horsemen announced that the procession was about to start for Calvary, she could not resist her longing desire to behold her beloved son once more, and she begged John to take her to some place through which he must pass. John conducted her to a palace, which had an entrance in that street which Jesus traversed after his first fall. John asked and obtained leave from a kind-hearted servant to stand at the entrance mentioned above, with Mary and her companions. The Mother of God was pale, her eyes were red with weeping, and she was closely wrapped in a cloak of bluish-gray color. The clamor and insulting speeches of the enraged multitude might be plainly heard, and a herald at that moment proclaimed in a loud voice that 3 criminals were about to be crucified. The servant opened the door. The dreadful sounds became more distinct every moment, and Mary threw herself on her knees. After praying fervently, she turned to John and said, Shall I remain? Ought I to go away? Shall I have strength to support such a sight? John made answer, If you do not remain to see him pass, you will grieve afterwards. They remained therefore near the door, with their eyes fixed on the procession, which was still distant, but advancing by slow degrees. When those who were carrying the instruments for the execution approached, and the mother of Jesus saw their insolent and triumphant looks, she could not control her feelings, but joined her hands as if to implore the help of heaven, upon which one among them said to his companions, What woman is that who is uttering such lamentations? Another answered, She is the mother of the Galilean. When the cruel men heard this, far from being moved to compassion, they began to make game of the grief of this most afflicted mother. They pointed at her, and one of them took the nails which were to be used for fastening Jesus to the cross, and presented them to her in an insulting manner. But she turned away, fixed her eyes upon Jesus, who was drawing near, and leaned against the pillar for support, lest she should again faint from grief, for her cheeks were as pale as death, and her lips almost blue. The Pharisees on horseback passed by first, followed by the boy who carried the inscription. Then came her beloved son. He was almost sinking under the heavy weight of his cross, and his head, still crowned with thorns, was drooping in agony on his shoulder. He cast a look of compassion and sorrow upon his mother, staggered, and fell for the second time upon his hands and knees. Mary was perfectly agonized at this sight. She forgot all else. She saw neither soldiers nor executioners. She saw nothing but her dearly beloved son, and springing from the doorway into the midst of the group who were insulting and abusing him, she threw herself on her knees by his side and embraced him. The only words I heard were, "Beloved son," and "Mother," but I do not know whether these words were really uttered or whether they were only in my mind. A momentary confusion ensued. John and the holy women endeavored to raise Mary from the ground, and the archers reproached her, one of them saying, "What hast thou to do here, woman? He would not have been in our hands if he had not been better brought up." A few of the soldiers looked touched, and although they obliged the Virgin to retire to the doorway, not one laid hands upon her. John and the women surrounded her as she fell half fainting against a stone, which was near the doorway and upon which the impression of her hands remained. This stone was very hard, and was afterwards removed to the first Catholic church built in Jerusalem, near the pool of Bethsaida, during the time that St. James the Less was bishop of that city. The two disciples who were with the mother of Jesus carried her into the house, and the door was shut. In the meantime, the archers had raised Jesus, and obliged him to carry the cross in a different manner, its arms being unfastened from the center, and entangled in the ropes with which he was bound. He supported them on his arm, and by means the weight of the body of the cross was a little taken off, as it dragged more on the ground. I saw numbers of persons standing about in groups, the greatest part amusing themselves by insulting our Lord in different ways, but a few veiled females were weeping. The fifth sorrow of Mary. Mary stands at the foot of the cross. I saw my son hanging pitifully, and I, his most sorrowful mother, was so grieved and heartbroken that I could barely stand up because of my great and bitter sorrow. When my son saw me, and his friends in inconsolable tears, he called out with a loud and sorrowful voice to his father, saying, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" It was as if he wanted to say, "There is no one who pities me but you, Father." Never was I able to forget that cry, not until I came to heaven. The cry that he uttered, moved more by my suffering than by his own. By this time his eyes seemed half dead, his cheeks were sunken, his face was sorrowful, his mouth open, and his tongue was bloody. His stomach was pressed in towards his back because of all the liquid that had been lost. It was as if he had no intestines. All his body was pale and languid because of the loss of blood. His hands and feet were very rigidly outstretched, for they had been extended and made to conform to the shape of the cross. His beard and hair were completely soaked with blood. When my son stood there so bruised and pale blue, only his heart was still vigorous, for it was of the best and strongest nature. He had taken from my flesh the most pure and well wrought body. His skin was so thin and tender that blood flowed out of it instantly if he was scourged even slightly. His blood was so fresh that it could be seen inside the pure skin, and because he had the very best constitution, life contended with death in this his pierced body. Sometimes the pain from his pierced limbs and sinews rose up to his heart, which was still completely vigorous and unhurt, and tormented it with the most unendurable pain and suffering. Sometimes the pain descended from his heart into his wounded limbs, and in doing so prolonged his bitter death. Surrounded by these pains, my son beheld his weeping friends who, with his help, would rather have suffered his pain themselves, or have burned in hell for all time than to see him tortured in this way. His sorrow over his friend's sorrow exceeded all the bitterness and grief which he had endured in body and heart, for he loved them so tenderly. Then, out of the exceedingly great suffering and anguish of his body, he cried out on account of his manhood to the Father, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. His half-closed eyes opened, and likewise his mouth was opened so that his bloody tongue was seen. His fingers and arms, which were as if paralyzed, stretched themselves out. But when he had given up his spirit, his head sank toward his chest. His hands lowered themselves a little from the place of the wounds, and his feet had to bear most of the weight of the body. When I, his most sorrowful mother, heard his voice, my whole body trembled in the bitter pain of my heart. As often as I later thought on this cry, it was as if it was still present and fresh in my ears. Then my hands became numb, my eyes were darkened, and my face became pale as a dead man. My ears could hear nothing, my mouth could not speak, my feet trembled, and my body fell to the ground. When I got up from the ground, I saw my son looking horribly disfigured and most miserable than a leper. I submitted my entire will to his knowing with certainty that everything had happened according to his will, and could not have happened unless he had allowed it. I therefore thanked him for everything, and so there was always some joy mixed with my sadness, because I saw that he, who had never sinned, had, in his great love, wanted to suffer this much for the sins of mankind. Meanwhile, other people standing nearby were saying almost insultingly, "O Mary, your son is dead." Others, more noble-minded, were saying, "Lady, your son's suffering is now ended unto his eternal glory." A little later, after his side had been opened up, the lance was pulled out with blood that was brown in color showing on its tip, which meant that the lance had pierced his heart. That penetrating lance was also felt going through my own heart, and it is a wonder that my heart did not burst. My daughter, consider the suffering of my son, for his limbs were like my own limbs, and his heart was like my own heart. For just as other children used to be carried in the womb of their mother, so was he in me. But he was conceived through the burning charity of God's love. Others, however, were conceived through the lust of the flesh. Thus, John the Evangelist, his cousin, rightly says, "The Word was made flesh." He came through love and was in me. The Word and love created him in me. He was truly for me like my own heart. For when I gave birth to him, I felt as though half my heart was born and went out of me. And when he endured suffering, it felt like my own heart was suffering. Just as when something is half inside and half outside, the half outside feels pain and suffering, but the inside also feels a similar pain. So it was with me when my son was scourged and wounded. It was as if my own heart was scourged and wounded. I was also the one closest to him at his suffering, and I was never separated from him. I stood very near his cross, and just like that which is closest to the heart stings the worst, so his pain was heavier and worse for me than for others. When he looked at me from the cross, and I saw him, then tears flowed from my eyes like blood from veins. And when he saw me so stricken with pain and overwhelming sorrow, he felt such a sorrow over my pain that all the pain of his own wounds became as subsided and dead for the sake of the pain he saw in me. I can therefore boldly say that his pain was my pain, since his heart was my heart. For just as Adam and Eve sold the world for an apple, so my son and I bought back the world as with one heart. Consider therefore, my daughter, how I was at the death of my son, and it will not be hard for you to give up the world and her cares. May all those who are in the world contemplate how I suffered when my son died, and always have it in front of their eyes and in their thoughts. Behold, what my son has endured for you, and love him with all your heart. The sixth sorrow of Mary. Jesus is taken down from the cross, and Mary holds the dead body of Jesus. Then, therefore, in distress from the exceeding anguish of his pain, and already near to death, he cried to the Father in a loud and tearful voice, saying, O Father, why have you forsaken me? He then had pale lips, a bloody tongue, and a sunken abdomen that adhered to his back as if he had no viscera within. A second time also he cried out again, in the greatest of pain and anxiety, O Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Then his head, raising itself a little, immediately bowed, and thus he sent forth his spirit. Then his mother then saw these things. She trembled at that immense bitterness, and would have fallen onto the earth if she had not been supported by the other women. Then, in that hour, his hands retracted slightly from the place of the nail holes, because of the exceeding weight of his body, and thus his body was as if supported by the nails with which his feet had been crucified. Moreover, his fingers and hands and arms were now more extended than before. His shoulder blades, in fact, and his back were as if pressed tightly to the cross. Then at last the Jews standing around cried out in mockery against his mother, saying many things. For some said, Mary, now your son is dead. But others said other mocking words. And while the crowds were thus standing about, one man came running with the greatest of fury and fixed a lance in his right side with such violence and force that the lance would have passed almost through the other side of the body. Thus, when the lance was extracted from the body, at once a stream, as it were, of blood spurted out that wound in abundance. In fact, the iron blade of that lance and a part of the shaft came out of the body red and stained with the blood. Seeing these things, his mother so violently trembled with bitter sighing that it is quite discernible in her face, and bearing that her soul was then being penetrated by a sharp sword of sorrow. When all these things had been accomplished, and when the large crowds were receding, certain of the Lord's friends took him down. Then, with pity, his mother received him into her most holy arms, and sitting, she laid him on her knee, all torn as he was, and wounded in black and blue. With tears, she and John and those others, the weeping women, washed him, and then, with her linen cloth, his most mournful mother wiped his whole body and its wounds, and she closed his eyes and kissed them, and she wrapped him in a clean cloth of fine linen. The seventh sorrow of Mary. Jesus is placed into the tomb. Mary spoke, You should reflect on 5 things, my daughter. First, how every limb in my son's body grew stiff and cold at his death, and how the blood that flowed from his wounds as he was suffering dried up and clung to each limb. Second, how his heart was pierced so bitterly and mercilessly that the man speared it until the lance hit a rib, and both parts of the heart were on the lance. Third, reflect on how he was taken down from the cross. The 2 men who took him down from the cross made use of 3 step ladders. One reached to his feet, the second just below his armpits and arms, the third to the middle of the body. The first man got up and held him by the middle. The second, getting up on another ladder, first pulled a nail out of one arm, then moved the ladder and pulled the nail from the other hand. The nails extended through the crossbeam. The man who had been holding up the weight of the body then went down as slowly and carefully as he could, while the other man got up on the step ladder that went to the feet and pulled out the nails from the feet. When he was lowered to the ground, one of them held the body by the head and the other by the feet. I, his mother, held him about the waist, and so the 3 of us carried him to a rock that I covered with a clean sheet, and in that we wrapped his body. I did not sew the sheet together, because I knew that he would not decay in the grave. After that came Mary Magdalene, and the other holy women. Angels too, as many as the atoms of the sun, were there, showing their allegiance to their Creator. None can tell what sorrow I had at the time. I was like a woman, giving birth, who shakes in every limb of her body after the delivery. Although she can scarcely breathe due to the pain, still she rejoices inwardly as much as she can because she knows that the child she has given birth to will never return to the same painful ordeal he has just left. In the same way, although no sorrow could compare with my sorrow over the death of my son, still I rejoiced in my soul because I knew my son would no longer die but would live forever. Thus my sorrow was mixed with a measure of joy. I can truly say that there were 2 hearts in the one grave where my son was buried. Is it not said, Where your treasure is, there is your heart as well? So my thoughts and my heart were ever in the sepulchre of my son.